This is a piece of equipment that is sealing a sterile barrier. This is that last barrier keeping the contents sterile before it's used on a patient. It's extremely important. So it's not that benign piece of equipment. It's imperative that it's functioning properly.
Rising above the ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for people, processes and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
You're listening to Beyond Clean with Hank and Justin, and today we are talking with Kevin Anderson, clinical education specialist at HealthMark. We're going to be talking about heat sealers, and the last time, and I think you're the one that reminded me of this, Hank, last time we talked to Kevin, we talked about pens, ink pens specifically, and so this is your go-to guest for all of these nuanced conversations, and I have no doubt that Kevin's going to bring a lot of knowledge for us today.
I'll tell you what, Justin, we know this show's not scripted because that's what I was going to say. You took my intro. You son of a gun. No, Kevin is fantastic.
You had it coming.
Yeah, no.
Just so you know, we've already recorded the interview, and Hank took all my good questions at this one.
If folks only knew what you put up with, Justin, yeah, they'd feel so sorry for you. No, but serious. We love talking to Kevin about these granular issues because, like I told Kevin after the interview, this is real life. This is sterile processing to a T because we deal with the details. It's not just the big equipment. It's not just the big instruments. It's everything down to the minute level has to be right every instrument, every time. And there's no better example of that than these heat sealers. So we're really excited to get into the interview today.
All right. We're going to be right back with Kevin after a short break. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Kevin Anderson, clinical education specialist at HealthMark. Kevin, you continue to set the pace in terms of record appearances on Beyond Clean. So congratulations for still holding that award tightly in your grips. But welcome to the show once again. We're going to be talking about heat sealers and things that maybe not everybody is aware about. So thanks for coming on the show again.
Well, thanks, Justin, for having me. Thank you, Hank, as well. It's a great topic, and I've learned a lot about this in the past couple of years. So looking forward to sharing some things about it. And I think it's really important. So looking forward to getting into it.
Well, this is a podcast. You have a podcast. So if anybody's listening, they probably know who you are. And I'm not sure that it makes a ton of sense to necessarily reintroduce you in that formal way as we have on past shows. I'll just say, go ahead and look back and listen to any one of the other episodes. It's some of the greatest content we're putting out on Beyond Clean. So what I'd rather do to kind of warm us up for the interview is have you tell us an interesting fact about you since we're getting to know you so well on the podcast.
Oh my gosh. One of my favorite things to be doing right now is two things that I'm learning outside of sterile processing. One of them is photography. All right. So one of my sons in baseball, my daughters have been in dance and plays and other things like that. So I've been learning how to take better photography of those types of events. So that's been interesting, learning all of that. And I'm spinning my wheels to see how I can maybe apply that somehow in the sterile processing space as well. But it's been fun learning to take better pictures with better equipment and things like that. It's, entry level stuff, but that's one thing. The other thing is I've been diving into a lot of books lately via the Libby app. So if you don't have it, check it out, because as a parent of three people, three kids, my wife and I were extremely busy. I like to read, but I've never considered myself a reader because it just flat out took me too long, and I couldn't stay the course long enough to finish books. So this app has really allowed me to get through a lot of really good books via audio books. So it's been fantastic. I think I've read or listened to about 9 books so far this year, and they're all
nice.
Really good. Some of them I have to re-listen to because, when you're listening to the book, you're doing other things like dishes or laundry or something like that. But lots of great content that you might want to go over and over again, repeatedly.
What's your favorite book so far?
The Infinite Game is a good one by Simon Sinek. That's a really good book. There's several of them. Let's see if I can find one really quick. Made to Stick was another great book. Can't remember the author off the top of my head, but Made to Stick is another good one. That actually is really good for us content creators, by the way. So check that one out.
I was going to ask you, Kevin, if you listened to the newest Hank Balch book, the Sterile Processing Word Puzzles. I don't know if that's on Libby or not.
If it was, you would probably know about it because they would have probably asked you to read it for the audio version. But of course, I should get my hands on that one.
So I wanted to tell you too about the photography stuff that I don't know if we've said it on the podcast before or if it came up in a panel, but there's this poor girl who is like the stock photography girl who's got like purple gloves and like scrubs or like scrubs and PPE, and like there's probably 10 or 12 brands around the industry that use this girl for all of their photography because there is such a limited supply of stock photography in sterile processing. So at the very least, I can tell you there is a market for some high quality photos, and just put this little girl out of her misery because she's been all over the place representing so many different products she had no idea she would ever be a part of.
That's a really good point, because when you're looking for stock photography for sterile processing, it is hard to find. And I actually take notice when I see a good one and I'm like, whoa, where did that come from?
Right.
So you're absolutely right about that.
So the theme of this season is the power to process, and we're talking all about the equipment that keeps our sterile processing departments humming and buzzing, or whatever kind of sound your piece of equipment happens to make. As Justin mentioned, we're talking to you today about a piece of equipment that's kind of easy to overlook, I think, at times, because it's not that big, it's not that shiny, and yet I've got a feeling that you're going to convince us by the end of this interview that it's quite important. Talk to us, like very low level here for introductory folks who may be like new to the industry, students listening, or perhaps, vendors who support these departments who may not know what a heat sealer is. Describe it, and then tell us when and why it's needed in the sterile processing workflow.
Sure. I guess to start with the simplest explanation in the beginning is just that the heat sealer is a device that we use pretty much every single day in sterile processing, because our peel pouches only come with 2, maybe 3 sides already sealed from the manufacturer. And so once we load them with the contents, a forcep or what have you, we need to finish the sealing job before it can go into sterilization. So we use these heat sealers to seal up either the 1 or 2 remaining sides that need to be sealed for the contents to be protected. Because as you know, peel pouches, even though they're kind of the less rigid of all the methods, the sterile barrier methods, or the less thick or whatever, however you want to put it, the most fragile, they still need to be sealed up. They're paper and plastic, or they're Tyvek and plastic, and they need to be sealed up on all 4 sides. So that's the simplest version I can give you, but it's funny because it is one of the most, I think, overlooked pieces of equipment that we use so regularly in a department.
So talk to us about the different variations, because if you've been in the industry, if you worked in multiple departments, you've probably run in to different styles of these heat sealers that are on the market today. What have you seen out there, and kind of, paint the picture about the options that are in the market today?
Sure. So I've had the luxury of being able to go and visit a lot of different departments in my role with Healthmark. And by far, there are two variations of this piece of equipment that are all over the place. And the one type is a bar type sealer. So basically you're going to stick the peel pouch inside and then raise or lower a bar in order to provide contact with heat, pressure, and some time as well to get that seal. The other one is known as a continuous feed sealer. So this is the one that kind of brings your peel pouch from the left side all the way to the right side and provides a roll underneath that provides the pressure, the heat, and the contact time. Again, reproducible and provides that seal. So really, it's those two types that we see primarily throughout all the departments that we visit.
All right. So tell me this, Kevin, what can go wrong? Is this such a simple piece of equipment that nothing ever goes wrong with it? Or what issues are commonplace?
So a couple things that I will share based on my experience. So number one, as you guys know, I did used to work in the operating room. So I will tell you from an end user standpoint, there were times when I worked in the operating room when I remember that the seals on peel pouches were prone to failure and things would just like fall out. It would have the appearance of a good, proper seal, but the seal just gave way really easily. And, you'd be running into the OR with a second peel pouch or a peel pouch of something that was not anticipated before the case. And you'd go to open it and it would be like, oh, it's already open. So I can't use this now. And now you got to run back out and get another one and hope that the same problem didn't come up again on the next one. So that would be one, is that even sometimes when the seal might look proper, look like it's good and everything's fine, it isn't always. And so when we go to the OR and try and open it, there are times when it does fail, even when it looks good. So that would be one.
What do you do about that? Like, how do you check for that? If it, like you said, it looks good. So if you've done it and it looks good, how do you know that it was done right?
So that was something that, of course, I tried to address with the one sterile processing technician, the lead tech that I had a pretty good relationship with at the time. And he showed me back then what they were told to do, which was actually to run it through the heat sealer twice because it wasn't providing the proper seal. But I have a hunch after learning more about the heat sealer now that probably wasn't the best way to fix the problem. That was more of a Band-Aid solution, right? And we do that. All right. So I'm not saying anything bad about him or his advice or what they were doing to try to solve the problem, because we all do those things. But one thing though, to address what you're saying is I might suggest, like we do with a sterile tray, like we do sterile tray audits, right? We try to proactively do this. Not everyone does, but I would encourage people to do so. Take trays that are ready for patient use, open them up and check them for all the little things that you want done with a tray, the indicators, all that. Do the same thing with your peel pouch, right? Pull a peel pouch off, test it, see what it's like to open it to the sterile field. I know you have some of those bins are chock full of peel pouch items, probably too full in some cases. So go up there, find items that aren't used very frequently, check the seal, just open it up, see what it's like to be the surgical tech or the surgical nurse opening up the peel pouch and see if it feels right to you. All right. So that would be one recommendation that I think that anyone could do at any time, is just to kind of audit what it's like to open the peel pouch. And that might give you some feedback right there on how well you're sealing.
Now, Kev, you mentioned earlier, the two styles or variations that are most common in the market. Is there anything in your perspective, and I'm asking your opinion, right? But in your opinion, are there certain pros or cons with the bar system versus that continuous sealing method that you mentioned?
Yeah, there's pros and cons to be aware of. I will say in my experience, it seems like the bar type seal can be a very good seal. The problem is that people need to know how to use it properly. And that's not always the case. So when you use a bar type seal, oftentimes there is like a filament inside of that bar type sealer. And if that filament is not rotated, there's actually a knob on most of the models on the side of the unit where you rotate that filament. It will start to wear out the filament and produce a defective seal, if you will, or not as good of a seal. So that is one thing about those that's really important to know that I don't believe everyone knows. And I can tell you that because sometimes when you go into a facility and you look at the peel pouches, you can look at the seal and you can tell there's a problem. And it's usually because they have a bar type seal and they're not rotating the filament. The other thing about those bar type sealers is that we're creatures of a habit. And usually what we do is we put the peel pouch into the same spot of the bar sealer. So that part of the bar sealer and that part of the filament is going to wear out faster. So if you were to kind of rotate where you put it into the bar sealer, it would rotate it would wear out less frequently, if that makes sense. So the continuous feed sealer is feeding across an entire length of heat and pressure, and it's giving a consistent time as well. And so it's a little bit more reproducible. Now, all of that being said, of course, I think that is a pro that is really important in today's sterile processing department. I do want to make sure people understand if you have a bar type sealer, you're not doomed to terrible seals. You just have to know how to use it. You have to make sure no matter what type of seal, whether it's continuous feed or bar type, that you're doing the preventive maintenance and things like that. And you're doing the training and education and competency that needs to be done.
Is it a cost difference then with the bar sealer? Like I'm assuming that's the older model that's been in the market probably longer, and I would assume that it's more affordable. So if you're monitoring that filament piece and kind of the spacing piece, then you can still, to your point, you can still have good seals with that. Is there anything else really that's differentiating those two besides price?
I think that, for me, I think that if I was going to run a department and start it up from scratch all over again, I would go with the continuous feed only because I think it's an easier process to get a reproducible seal with it. So, I think that would be the more reliable way to go. Again, those are the main, pros and cons.
Is it more efficient too for the staff?
Yeah, I think it's more efficient. I think that you have the ability with a bar seal, and again, depending on the model, sometimes you might, like my old friend, lead tech, was telling me you might have to raise or lower the bar twice or whatever. So you get into these circumstances where you could run into that where you're like questioning whether or not how many times you have to raise or lower the bar. Whereas the continuous feed, it's always the same every single time. So yeah, to your point, it could be much more efficient to use the continuous feed type heat seal.
Do we want to dive into the PMs a little further? Is there more to say?
Yeah, the thing that's really important about PMs with heat sealers is just that I think people look at this piece of equipment, to Hank's point earlier in the podcast, is such a benign piece of equipment. It's just like there and it just seems to work and like no one really gives it a second thought. But you have to realize that this is a piece of equipment that is sealing a sterile barrier. This is that last barrier keeping the contents sterile before it's used on a patient. It's extremely important. So it's not that benign piece of equipment. It's imperative that it's functioning properly. And so one of the things that I can tell you, at least from the continuous feed type, I don't know if this is true with the bar type. Maybe it is.
So when we talk about it not sealing properly. You were describing this scenario when you were working in the operating room and it would come up and then you realized it wasn't even sealed at all. You can't use it. You've got to go get another one. Was that something that was commonplace? And regardless of whether or not it was commonplace, how much frustration did it cause? And I'm just wondering, from the perspective of sterile processing and its perception in the operating room, how much do these heat sealers end up really having an influence over that?
Well, I think what happens is, at least in the particular case that I'm talking about, there was a run of seal issues for a good while. It was going on for probably a couple weeks, and it wasn't just me. So what happens was there were so many complaints that they then reached out to the manufacturer and got everything situated. But when it happens, and it's happening to everybody, it is very frustrating, because not only sometimes you have to realize in the operating room, things don't go according to plan all the time. And sometimes when you're running out to get something in a peel pouch, it's because a patient is bleeding and you're trying to control bleeding, or something unexpected has happened and you're trying to get ready for, opening the case instead of doing it laparoscopic. There's a lot going on. And of course, if it's happening to multiple people in different ORs, your confidence level in what sterile processing is doing is going down, especially when they can't really explain to you why, and the seal looks good. That's a lot of stuff to be kind of taking on and not having an explanation for it. It's not a good look. It lowers the confidence level, which is not what we want for our sterile processing department.
If I had to retitle the episode, I would call this Heat Sealers, the epicenter of OR culture.
Yeah.
Because of the impact that you're describing there. And it's true, like you said, and like I said at the beginning, it's this unassuming device, but it has tremendous impact if it's not used appropriately, or if the result of its use is not meeting those standards. So unfortunately, the title of this episode is not the cultural epicenter. It's 3 things that you may not know about heat sealers. So what are those 3 things, if you had to condense that list to, 3 top things or 3 random things that you think folks don't know or may not know?
Sure. Well, I think one that we hit on was PMs. And the reason I want to say that is because we tend to just trust that Biomed is doing PMs on everything and documenting everything and taking care of everything. That is not always the case. Usually they're doing that with bigger items like sterilizers and washers and stuff like that. But these less assuming pieces of equipment like heat sealers, they're not always on top of the PMs for that until they get a call or something like that. They may not even know there's a PM schedule for it. So don't assume that they know about it, and make sure that you're asking them about it and taking care of it, whether it's a bar type or continuous feed type, doesn't matter. Another one is that I had mentioned Joint Commission. Well, one thing that we have heard recently is surveyors have come into departments and actually asked staff and sterile processing departments, how are they testing their heat sealer to make sure that it's working properly? Which leads me to another point, which is a lot of people don't know that you can verify your heat sealer and make sure that it is working properly. All right. So there are some simple tests. There's ways you can do it visually, where you're just kind of, you're running the seal. We have a product at HealthMart called Daily Seal Check, and you can literally just do a seal and it allows you to document it right there on the peel pouch, but you're just visually inspecting it for a proper seal, which is great. You should actually get in the habit of visually checking your seal every single time anyway. But there is a dye test too, and that dye test is fantastic because it makes even the less visible, the less obvious defects more obvious to people. So it's a great way to kind of verify that your heat sealer is in fact sealing properly.
I'm interested to hear the feedback from the audience on this episode. And with that last comment, you're kind of getting to what I was pressing you about with the bar and the continual flow sealers, because there's a little bit of experiential debate between which one of those gives you the more consistent seal, especially as it comes to those kind of folds or runs that you see oftentimes in the pill pack. And I think you had a good answer, is it all goes down to the user. If the user is properly using whatever device, you're going to get a good seal. And if there's, lack of training or competence or, whatever, then it's not going to work the way it was designed. So I don't think we can blame it necessarily on equipment. That being said, there is still some debate out there. And the fact that you brought up, those verification tests, I think is very, very important, because it's not just about, is it sealing all the way across, but are there those defects that you mentioned? Is it the right, length and width, right? So you want to get the complete all the way across, but it's also got to be deep enough. I know for the topic of this show, we're not talking about the sizing of your pill packs necessarily, but that's also important, because you're not going to be able to seal properly if there's just not enough physical room in that pack with your device. Before we go too far off base here, let me stay on track and ask you the next question about myths and misconceptions. We love this question on Beyond Clean. We ask it all the time about all the topics that we have folks on. But what are the myths around heat sealers that you think are important for people to know, or the misconceptions out there that they should be paying attention to?
Well, I think that we kind of touched on one before, and that is just that this heat sealer is just going to work properly if it's heating up and it's at temperature or whatever, and you can just go about your day and just use it no matter what. I think that the biggest myth really is that we can just blindly trust it to provide a perfect seal every time. And I think that that's because it is such a simple machine, and it does do such a great job most of the time. But when there is an issue with your heat sealer and then it leads to problems in the operating room, it is seriously maddening, number one, but it also a huge potential patient safety issue. So that would be, I think, the biggest myth, is trying to rely on it like it's going to be perfect every single time, just assuming that it's going to work every single time. This is something that we cannot get ourselves in the habit of doing, whether it's a heat sealer or any other piece of equipment, no matter how simple or complex. But I did want to mention, I think I gave you two things that people may not know. I wanted to give you one more I almost forgot about. This is really important, is that there are different temperatures for different types of peel pouches. This is something I didn't know when I first came into sterile processing, is that there are different temperatures that are used to provide that seal for the paper plastic versus the Tyvek. So there is generally a higher temperature for the paper plastic than there is for the Tyvek and plastic. So if you're using the same heat sealer for both types of pouches, you have to make sure that you're setting the temperature accordingly. And if you don't, you could end up melting the seal on the Tyvek one and causing damage to it. And I'm sure there are people who have done that. Yes. And so one thing that you might try to do, if, again, this is how I would probably handle it, is get two different heat sealers and set them at two different temperatures. I know not everyone has the space or the dollars or what have you, but to keep things simple and to make it a little bit easier on the staff to know when and what to use without changing temperatures all the time, get two of them, set one for Tyvek, set one for paper plastic, and away you go. But that would be the third thing that I think people really need to remember and not take for granted, because I think older, more experienced techs might forget to tell the younger ones about this. It's a kind of a simple thing that maybe we do on cruise control that some of the younger ones or less experienced may not know.
Well, Kevin, we started off this interview or this episode by talking about, well, this seems like a pretty simple technology. Maybe we all take it for granted. And then we learned that there are definitely some areas where it's a blind spot. during our discussion today. So I don't want to take this technology for granted and say it's not going anywhere in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of advancements or innovation or, just the use of the technology. If you were to kind of project out what you think the trending is there continued advancements here? Are there new technologies that would disrupt this, pretty established technology? What's your thoughts?
Sure. So all I can say, I'm going to preface what I'm going to say by saying that I don't have any unique knowledge on this being from a manufacturer. So don't take what I'm saying as, Healthmark's working on this. I don't see that part. So I am not sure about this, but what I would like to see happen would be something that, helps the users in terms of, Hank touched on it, getting the proper size pouch, monitoring the weight of the item. So like you're putting your item on a scale, if you will, that tells you how much it weighs, and it will tell you, what would the ideal size pouch be? What would the ideal, and then if you're prepping for a modality, I'm going into VPRO or vaporized hydrogen peroxide. Sorry, I'm bringing up brand names, but if you put in the modality, you put your instrument on this scale that has a little bit of AI going on, machine learning. It can maybe kick out exactly what size pouch, what type of pouch, and the best way to seal it and all of that. I think that would be pretty cool to kind of simplify the process and make it a little bit more like, okay, it doesn't matter if Kevin's on the heat sealer today or Justin's on the heat sealer. We're going to seal this one instrument at the same time every single time. That would be kind of what I would like to see. Do I know if it's happening? I have no idea. I think it would be really cool though.
All right, Kevin, great job as always on the interview. And I do want everybody to know, if they don't already, that you do a podcast with Healthmark. You do a very fine job with that podcast. And we love the support that you've given us since day one here at Beyond Clean. And this was a pretty granular, very detailed conversation. And somehow this episode's going to go over 30 minutes. So that's just a little bit of a kudos going back your way for being a pro, because lots of detail, lots of good nuggets in here to keep in mind moving forward. So great job. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Justin. And thank you, Hank. I appreciate it as always.
That was Kevin Anderson, clinical education specialist at Healthmark. And Hank, great episode talking about heat sealers, some common things to be aware of, definitely what you need to be having in mind when it comes to surveys and just regulatory guidelines, and making sure that this isn't a blind spot for your PM processes, which I could definitely see that happening. I could see this one getting neglected, and then all of a sudden you wind up having this quality issue like Kevin described having happened to him when he was working in the OR. And that is really difficult PR to be having with the operating room. It's not something that you want detracting from your day to day, that's for sure. And not in today's environment either.
Hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of these pill packs come out of these medium to large size departments every single day. And they're going to the OR, they're going to the ER, they're going offsite to clinics. I mean, it's one device has implications all over the place. So everything that Kevin brought up and all the insight and perspective, completely applicable and applicable immediately for folks to go back and check that PM schedule that we've been referencing, to begin to verify those seals, to document all of that. Hugely important topic, even though it is a little bit random.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Amazon, Google, or Apple Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or just search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app. You can also find bonus content for some of these episodes, but you've got to download the smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there in the marketplace, we'd really appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to us here at the show. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you just have a question on any of these interviews, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.